welcome our guest today for the Division 15 webinar, Dr. Mimi Bong. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Dr. Bong is a professor of educational psychology at Korea University, where she also serves as the director of the Brain and Motivation Research Institute. Her research expertise centers on academic motivation, and she's published extensively on this topic. This body of work includes studies about many of the prominent constructs in the field, such as student self-efficacy, self-concept, attributions, values, implicit theories, and achievement goals. In 2008, she received the division's Richard E. Snow Award for Early Contributions in Educational Psychology. She has served on numerous journal editorial boards and will be the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Experimental Education starting in January of 2022. We also want to give a shout out to Division 15 for providing us with a subscription to Mentimeter to make this webinar a more interactive experience for our audience members. And so let's get started. Dr. Bong, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Well, first of all, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on some of the controversies that I think exist in the motivation literature as relevant to education. So folks are joining in from, I wonder who that is, joining in us from Baltimore, Maryland, but wow. So thank you so much for joining us to listen to my talk, because I know it's Friday morning in the United States. It's 11 o'clock in Seoul. So without further ado, let me just, much of the content of my talk, not all, but much of the talk today will be based on this upcoming book, Motivation Science, Controversies and Insights, edited by myself, John Marshall Reeve, and Sung-Il Kim. And it's supposed to become available sometime next year from Oxford University Press. Okay, so some controversies, old and new. Now here's a question. When do you think extrinsic rewards motivate people? Okay, when there's no intrinsic motivation, money, the reward is big enough, when they find value in it for altruistic reasons. Okay, when intrinsic motivation is low. Yeah, so I see a lot of answers. Okay, when the task is easy on time. Okay, great. When geared on themselves. All right, so I see a lot of answers about when intrinsic motivation is low, and hey, interesting one here. When intrinsic motivation is already present. Interesting. Okay, so all right, so you might think that this debate has been over, a couple of decades ago, but actually it's not. So there are people who believe extrinsic rewards undermine motivation, but there are also people who believe extrinsic rewards actually help rather than undermine motivation. So people who argue that the harmful effect of extrinsic rewards argue that we have to really motivate people to utilize their inner resources by asking them, by empowering them to draw on their own interests, own value, and own identities. Because once we give them extrinsic rewards, especially for activities they already find interesting, then that'll undermine their intrinsic motivation. And lots of experiments conducted within the framework of intrinsic motivation and self-determination theory actually produce evidence that support this argument. Children who like to draw, but after draw without any reward, after getting rewarded, stop engaging in the activity as frequently as before. College students who study hard for intrinsic reasons stop studying as hard after they're being paid for studying. So what explains this undermining effect? I think a lot of you already know the over-justification effect. So for example, there are many people who join us today, and let's suppose Jason or David bribe some of you, say, hey, we're really worried about the attendance today, so I'll give you $100 secretly after the session is over. And that's the reward. So even if you find my talk interesting and topic interesting, if you're in it to get that $100 at the end of my talk, then you think, oh, that explains why I'm here, why I'm sacrificing my Friday morning listening to Mimi Bong to get that $100, right? So that's over justification. Now we know, after continued research with this topic, that the effect is not that simple. It's complex because it all depends on whether or not the extrinsic rewards are used to control or to inform. So for example, if the reward is given for simply merely attending a class, simply participating in an activity, or completing an assignment, or given for, given before the activity, so you fully expect to receive the reward, and given for simple and routine tasks. And as someone else already typed in, when the rewards are salient, then they tend to have undermining effect because they are perceived as an attempt to control your behavior. However, when it's given to you after the fact as a token of appreciation, for example, or it gives you an information about how much progress you have made and whether or not you have accomplished some short-term goals, then it is giving you some useful information about how your competence has been improved. So that's not necessarily undermining to your intrinsic motivation. So the conclusion that the camp of people on this side is, yes, extrinsic rewards undermine motivation, and strong incentive will get the person act and increase behavior short term, but it won't keep the person engaged in and persist in the long run. Now, as many of you might remember, this debate about the undermining effect of intrinsic undermining effect of extrinsic rewards have become very fierce after a couple of meta-analyses have been published, like almost 2 decades ago by a group of researchers. And these meta-analyses provide evidence that extrinsic rewards do not necessarily undermine intrinsic motivation. And actually, rewards can produce produce motivation and performance that are comparable to the motivation and performance induced by intrinsic motivation. So then there are a lot of additional experiments have been conducted to find out that the effect is not as simple. However, the debate has been rekindled, in my view, recently because of the availability of evidence from neuroscientific research. So for example, Suzanne Heady and Renninger claimed that the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is really arbitrary, because if we look at the evidence coming out of the neuroscientific literature, then when people are motivated for intrinsic reasons, or when people are motivated because they're given some rewards, the same reward circuitry in the brain is being activated. So in other words, it's not really distinguishable at the brain level. And also there's evidence that when people process the presence of rewards, it actually improves attention and memory rather than decrease attention. And so they argue that rewards are most useful when trying to help, and this point a lot of you have already mentioned, to help the uninterested to engage in and start making meaningful connections with the activity in the first place. So they cite the interview by Sosniak of accomplished pianists, and because many of them recounted how they relied on external incentives during the early stages when their skills are still being developed and they are still making connections with the playing the piano activity. Once they become interested in the activity, then participating and doing the activity itself can be a reward, and after which you might not need the external rewards. But in order to get people do things and find the activity interesting and get them engaged in the activity in the first place, rewards might be effective. And so their conclusion is actually diametrically opposite to the one that we have seen before. They argue that rewards can strengthen the positive effects of intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation may be sufficient in the short run, but rewards are needed to sustain motivation in the long run. So again, the example is something like this. Let's say you're a pianist and you've been playing the piano for the past 10, 15 years out of fun because you love it, but you're a professional pianist, but nobody recognizes your performance. Would you still go on, playing the piano just for the intrinsic reasons? even if you're not paid, you're not being recognized, you need some wouldn't you need some recognition? Would that help? So that's their argument. So this argument, this debate is still well and alive, and we probably look for more evidence coming out from the neuroscientific literature. So that's the first controversy that I'd like to introduce to you today. Let's move on to the second one. So here's a question. Can you name one motivation that is always good and always bad? So let's start with the one that is always good. Can you name one motivation that is always good? Learning motivation, self-efficacy. I like this, showing my bias. Interest, another good one. Okay, mastery learning, helping others. All right, so is there a good motivation and a bad motivation? See, again, there are researchers, especially self-determination theorists, who believe, yes, definitely, there are some motivations are good, some motivations are bad. So they claim that the belief that more motivated you are, the better outcomes follow, that's a myth, because we have to distinguish between autonomous versus controlled motivation. So Martin Van Steenkiste and Bart Stonens came up with this interesting terminology, wantivation versus mustivation. I think that was clever. So they argue that, they emphasize the role of environment. So if you're in a need-satisfying environment, you're motivated, and that motivation is a good motivation, and that leads to that helps you to feel happy and subjective well-being. However, if you perform in a need-thwarting environment, then you tend to function with bad motivation, and which leads to stress and anxiety. So there are 3 good motivations and 2 bad motivations according to their view. And the 3 good motivations include intrinsic motivation, integrated motivation, and identified motivation. And the 2 bad motivations, controlled motivations, include introjected motivation and extrinsic motivation. I'm not going to get into the details of what each of these motivation or regulations are, because you've probably read all about it in the textbook and the articles. But the gist of their argument is that, there are good and bad motivations, and it can be determined by the quality of motivation. And there are people who take a look at this question from a slightly different perspective. For example, Alan Wakefield, when asked this question, asks back, hey, so from which angle should we answer this question? Because if we focus on the quantity of motivation, then typically, we think strong self-efficacy is good, weak self-efficacy is bad, high task value is good, and low task value is bad. But we think of this question from the quality of motivation, as we have seen already. We can talk about intrinsic motivation as good and extrinsic motivation as bad. Growth mindset is good motivation, and fixed mindset is bad. Mastery goal is a good one, and I'm going to jump over the normative, and you know why, because that's another controversy that I'll be talking about today. But so ability and appearance goal is bad. He further asked, what about intentions though? So we can talk about motivation, but motivations for what? For example, war criminals were motivated clearly to do what they did, but can we say that's good because they're motivated? So Alan Wakefield tackles this question from a slightly different point of view, and I would say he's in the middle ground. Then there are researchers who believe this question represents a false dichotomy, and here's why. If you look at the definition of motivation, and I listed 3 of them on the screen, there's really no statement or stipulation about the nature of goals. Motivation simply refers to, for example, the processes that drive, select, and direct behaviors toward one's goals. It's a process whereby goal-directed actions are instigated and sustained, and it is the energization and direction of behavior. In other words, motivation is amoral. So many criminals, for example, bank robbers, they're motivated to do what they're planning to do, and they want it bad. They think this is extremely important, and they are very confident that they can pull it off successfully without getting caught. So motivation is amoral, and when we discuss motivation, we simply have to say these criminals are motivated. Pat Alexander answers this question again from a slightly different perspective. She thinks this is a false dichotomy because even the most uncontroversial motivational constructs that are known to be good or bad can be judged differently depending on the circumstances. So I just took two examples that she provided. For example, self-efficacy, that is considered typically a good motivation because strong self-efficacy leads to great effort, low anxiety, and high achievement. However, and this is an example. So if you look at the US students' math performance on the PISA, the performance for international student assessment, they're typically perform below average out of, I think, around 40 countries that participate in the PISA, but their confidence is number one. And that's probably because they're overconfident. So it's a calibration issue. If you are too self-efficacious, that might give you, that might make you not invest enough effort to achieve to do what you're supposed to do. Now, A motivation is typically considered bad, but whose perspective is it? It's bad from the perspective of teachers and researchers and maybe parents. But if you think about this question from the perspective of students, maybe it represents a effective coping strategy on their part to save energy to do other things, other more important, more interesting, and other competing goals. So for these group of researchers, then the good and bad question motivation represents a false dichotomy. Okay, so that was a second controversy. Now moving on to the third controversy that I personally think is important. Are self-efficacy and self-concept the same thing? All right, so totally different, exactly the same, totally different. I have no idea. This is a silly academic argument. Okay, let's see. Really? Something's going on. I don't think this is right. Okay, so this is a silly 5%. Okay, I have no idea. Oh no, the yellow bar is going up. Okay, down. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds to see what people think. Okay, I have no idea. This is silly academic argument, 14%, totally different, 74, exactly the same. Okay, that's good, exactly the same, 2%. All right, about 20% of you think, a little less than 20%, this is a silly academic argument. That really hurts me. That denies half of my contribution to the literature. But I have no idea. 76% think totally different, 2% exactly the same. All right, so honestly, I thought this debate was over 18 years ago, but it's still well and alive because Herb Marsh and colleagues have recently published this article in Journal of Education Psychology in 2019. And the title is The Murky Distinction Between Self-Concept and Self-Efficacy, Beware of Lurking Jingle Jangle Fallacies. So, as you know, jingle fallacies when two scales with the same name actually measure different things. And jangle fallacy is when the two scales with different names measure the same thing. And so their argument is that self-concept, outcome expectancy, and self-efficacy are basically the same thing, especially when they're all measured at the domain level. In this particular article, that was math. And also another argument is math self-concept is a stronger predictor of a variety of things than math self-efficacy, including the GPA, standardized test scores, and aspiration to study math in the future. Okay, so these are the 5 constructs that they assess in that study. They assess, and so I present the typical names and that are being used to assess those constructs, and then the sample item. So math self-concept. In math, I'm a talented student. Math outcome expectancy, I'm sure to get good marks in math if I try hard. Generalized math self-efficacy is actually math self-efficacy assessed at the domain level. So I'm confident that I can perform well on math tasks and in math homework. And then there are two self-efficacy measures. How confident are you that you can solve this math problem? That is test-related math self-efficacy. And you note that there are 3 items. So in the achievement measure, there are anywhere between 60 to 90 math test items, and they use 3 items. I don't know how representative that they might have been, but they picked 3 items and asked students to report their confidence to solve those problems successfully. And then there is functional math self-efficacy, which is actually, the confidence to do everyday tasks that involve math. So for example, how confident are you to be able to work out the price of a t-shirt when getting 20% off? We won't buy it unless it's 50% off, right? But anyhow, so the first 3, the top 3 are self-concept like measures, and the bottom 3 were treated in that article as self-efficacy like measures. And here's the result. So they claim the three self-concept, outcome expectancy, self-efficacy, the 3 constructs demonstrate very high correlation. And actually the covariation among the 3, the correlation, the way that they covary were explained by a single high order factor. So they say, hey, look, this is the result of the jangle fallacy. They're all called different names, right? Self-concept, outcome expectancy, and self-efficacy, but they're actually tapping a single one, the same thing. Whereas the bottom 2, the 2 constructs that they measure as self-efficacy, there was low correlation between these 2 measures. And they say, hey, look, this is an example of the jingle fallacy. Why? Because both of them are called self-efficacy, but they're not correlated high enough. And I would argue, actually, their findings actually lend very strong support for the distinctiveness of self-concept and self-efficacy. And here's why. So if you look at their results, the dimensional comparison, so there are 2 comparison processes that presumably operate when students form their academic self-concept. One is dimensional comparison, the other is social comparison. The dimensional comparison effect, as many of you already know, but I'm going to explain a little bit because many of the respondents previously said they have no idea. So it's internal and external frames of reference model. So they note that students' achievement in the verbal area and students' achievement in the math area are typically highly correlated. However, when we look at their verbal self-concept and math self-concept, they do not correlate significantly oftentimes. And so what's going on here? And that's a result of, according to this model, of the simultaneous operation of the internal and external comparison. So when we report and form our verbal self-concept, for example, we engage in internal comparison, comparing my own achievement in the verbal area with my achievement in the math area. Because relative superiority of my achievement in one of these 2 areas get accentuated, this comparison tend to result in negative correlation between my verbal self-concept and my math self-concept. But I also simultaneously engage in external comparison by comparing my own verbal achievement to the verbal achievement of others and my math achievement to the math achievement others, because typically the achievements are highly correlated. So that external comparison typically results in positive correlation between my verbal and math self-concepts. And the negative correlation from the internal comparison cancels out the positive correlation from the external comparison. That's why the resultant correlation between my verbal self-concept and that self-concept is close to 0. And that result has been repeatedly observed with regards to the self-concept measures, but not necessarily with self-efficacy measures. And in this study, they also did not find evidence of dimensional comparison with regard to the self-context specifically assessed and task specifically assessed self-efficacy measures. Also, the social comparison effects. One of the social comparison effects that are popular in self-concept literature is a big fish, little pond effect. So to simply put, 2 students with the same achievement, and one student attends a school with relatively poor performing peers. The other student attends a school with relatively better performing peers, and the student attending peers with poor performance will have high self-concept compared to the other student, because this student is now the big fish in a little pond. And so statistically then, class average achievement or school average achievement has a negative effect on the students' self-concepts, students attending that school. Now, this is also not observed with regard to self-efficacy measures. Okay. So many self-efficacy researchers point out the differences between self-concept and self-efficacy. And I personally think whether they're the same or different should not merely an empirical question. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's a good example, but people's height and weight, they typically are very strongly correlated, but we don't replace height with weight. They are the different things. Now, if I can show you some of the typical items used to measure one versus the other. In the left hand table, you see the typical self-concept items used to measure, in this case, writing self-concept. So as you can see in the highlighted portion there, it's about past achievement receives so much attention. I have always done well. I get good marks. And also, social comparison is very salient compared to others my age. I'm good, and also you see the emotional reactions that are attached to the recognized attributes and competence, such as I'm hopeless when it comes to math or writing, I'm satisfied with how well I do. Whereas if we move over to the right-hand side table, that's the self-efficacy items that Frank Pajares has used to assess, I believe, the writing self-efficacy of middle school students when they were about to compose a one-page story. So if you look at the items and then focus on the highlighted portion, you can see the self-efficacy is about the confidence, whether or not you can successfully execute the kind of behaviors that are required to achieve a achieve a successful performance in the task of writing composition of a one-page story. So I'm not necessarily saying one is better than the other. However, I believe there are two different beliefs because there is a clear difference, not only in the definition, but the levels at which one forms each belief and the levels at which the beliefs is really functional, the level at which the belief has a power to make people move. And also, as we have seen just now, the internal external frames of reference and social comparison, the big fish little pond effect, these are actually task irrelevant information, and self-concept tends to get biased by those information, whereas self-efficacy is not. Again, I'm not saying whether one is better than the other, but that's that's what we observe. Another important, I think, difference between the two constructs is that self-concept by definition takes time. In other words, we experience some things repeatedly, our performance, our attributes, and then we form self-concept. So by definition, self-concept is a stable perception that I have about myself, my attributes, my competence, and all that. So it is not easy to change one's self-concept over time because it requires extensive experience. Now, self-efficacy is also not necessarily easy to change if it's generalized or stabilized over repeated experiences. However, depending on the context, it is still possible to change one's self-efficacy. Let me give you an example. It is difficult if you're trying to change math self-concept of students overnight. It's probably not easy and close to impossible. It takes a lot of effort and time. However, we also may not be able to change students' math self-efficacy over time because that student probably has been gaining a lot of mastery experiences. However, if we we can at least change that student self-efficacy toward solving a particular type of math problems overnight. So I think that differentiates the two beliefs. Another question that I might want to ask the audience is that, hey, what is your self-efficacy to remember all the important points that I make and I'll be making toward the end of this talk? And that you can answer the question probably, but what if I ask, what is your self-concept of remembering all the important points that I'll be making during this talk? So I think that hopefully illustrates the difference in the functional significance between the two beliefs. Okay. All right. Moving over to the next controversy. Is trying to outperform your peers beneficial for learning? What do you think? Is it beneficial? sometimes yes. The majority of the responses went for sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay, most of the time it's bad. All right, so this is another controversy that is still going on. And okay, this is another hotly debated and emotionally charged topics, especially in the achievement literature, as many of you are probably aware. And it started out because of some of the unexpected results. When achievement, the construct and theory of achievement goal was first proposed, there was learning goal, which is supposed to be good orientation to have. And there is a performance goal, which is supposedly maladaptive. But as we continue doing research with these constructs, performance goals were often producing, results, positive results with regard to the prediction of achievement and performance indexes. And another reason, I think, why this topic received so much attention further is because Andy Elliott then proposed that we need to distinguish between performance approach and performance avoidance goals. And he also proposed that previously the achievement goal construct, at that time goal orientation, is sort of like a schema, achievement related schema, where we receive, process, interpret, and respond to the achievement relevant information, because it was defined as the underlying purposes and reasons of achievement relevant behavior. It mixes reasons with aims, and it's not clear. So as all the other goals are defined, we have to focus on the achievement related aims. So, for greater conceptual precision. In other words, so then the performance goal previously was a striving to, do better than others and demonstrate one's superiority or validate one's ability, is now redefined as the goal to attain normative competence. All right, and then Grant and Dweck, 2003, noticed that there had been mixed findings regarding the effects of performance goal. And they said, well, that's because the different types of performance goals have not been distinguished. So they distinguish performance goals into outcome goals, simply want to attain good outcomes, and ability validation goals, you want to demonstrate that you're able, your superior ability, and normative goals, you want to do better than others. And demonstrated, as you can see in the correlation table, it is only the ability validation goal that was associated with negative reactions, such as loss of intrinsic motivation, withdrawal, time and effort after they experience failure, but not necessarily the normative goal. Okay. There are researchers who performed meta-analysis using the distinction, and the results consistently found that normative goals are adaptive when it comes to achievement. For example, normative goals relate positively to achievement, self-regulation, use of deep strategies, and adaptive surface strategies such as memorizing important things. Whereas appearance goals, similar to ability validation goals, relate negatively to achievement, as well as use of maladaptive surface strategies, self-handicapping, and help-seeking avoidance. So these researchers are often lumped together as multiple goal perspectives and multiple goal theorists. And their main argument is pursuing normative goals along with mastery goals is most adaptive and is even more adaptive than pursuing the mastery goal alone. So this is one perspective regarding the potentially positive effects of performance goal. And there's another slightly different perspective, and that's goal complex model. And these researchers merge aims with reasons. So basically merging the achievement goal literature theory with the self-determination arguments. So what makes performance goal, for example, adaptive or maladaptive, depends on the reasons behind the pursuit. So for example, you can, when you can try to do better than others, but if you try to do better than others out of challenge, excitement, or because it's personally significant to you, then that may be adaptive. However, if you engage in the same behavior and pursue the same goal of trying to do better than others because you want to appear able, that's internal pressure, ego concerns, or because other people expect you to be, that's what's demanded of you. In other words, because of external pressure, then that's bad. So that's a slightly different perspective, but still they argue that the effective performance goal can be beneficial. Then there are a group of researchers, and these researchers are often, said to belong to the mastery goal camp. But their argument is no, not in the long run. In other words, they point out the fact that many of the findings that support the adaptive role of normative goals come out of the studies with college students and in competitive classrooms and with normative grading systems. And so they do not think the findings are necessarily applicable to K-12 classrooms. And this difference actually is more fundamental than the simple definition of construct, because it involves, I think, educational philosophy. So they argue, okay, so pursuing performance goals produces good results in a competitive systems, but then should we encourage or condone students' pursuit of normative goals because it produces good results in those systems, or should we try to change the systems so that students can pursue mastery goals? So that's their argument. Okay, and here's another empirical reasons for their argument. When we assess all these different goals, approach and avoidance, and normative and ability goals, they typically demonstrate a very strong correlation between the two. So if you think about the learning situation, especially when it comes to K-12 classroom situation, is it easy for you to imagine students wanting to do better than others with absolutely no regard of the possibility of doing worse than others? Is it easy to think of students who try to outperform others without, worrying absolutely not about wanting to also not do worse than others in case of failure? So in other words, it's not easy to distinguish between the approach pursuit and avoidance pursuit and normative goal pursuit and ability validation concerns, because many times students tend to do better than others so that they can demonstrate their competence. Now here, I'd like to share some quotes that I have from the late Jerry Brophy in his 2005 article. So he said, as someone who frequently synthesizes psychology-based research for teachers, I periodically encounter situations where external validity limitations require careful qualification when drawing classroom implications from experimental findings. He pointed out several times that students rarely mention that they study to outperform others unless they are given a survey questions that are asking them to report, whether or not they want to do better than others. And so he argued that students need to focus on mastering the learning task, and distraction from a task toward pure competition is likely to be counterproductive and associated with anxiety, worry, and other negative emotions. And so for Jerry Brophy then, to the question of is trying to do better than others, trying to outperform others is beneficial for learning, his answer is no, not in the short run, not even in a short run. There you go. Okay, so that's, I believe, is the fourth controversy that I prepared. Okay, so the next one, and you might want to answer this question. When it comes to our basic human needs, what do we really need in order to be optimally motivated? Need for autonomy, need for competence. John Marshall, are you there? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, feeling safety, relate, desire, supportive relationship. What else is there? Ability, mental bandwidth. Okay, interest, yes. Food, interesting, persistence. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the. Okay, thank you. So this is the next controversy. Do we need the needs to understand motivation? And we've already seen the answer. So there are people, researchers working in the self-determination theory, they claim, yes, there are three basic psychological needs. Those we have already seen that, right? Need for autonomy, need for competence, need for relatedness. And according to SDT, these needs are inborn and the basic needs. Why? Because satisfying those needs lead to positive psychological outcomes and full human functioning. So the environment can either satisfy, nurture these three basic needs, or thwart or stifle these three basic needs. So they say, yes, definitely, there are three basic psychological needs. More recently, Carol Dweck also talked about 7 psychological needs. 3 of them are basic, 4 of them are compound needs. So the 3 basic needs for her include acceptance by others and competence. Those two are very similar to the need for relatedness and need for competence that SDT talks about. And also, but she included, instead of autonomy, need for optimal predictability. Okay. And then she also proposed 4 compound needs, which can be made by various combinations of the basic needs, include need for trust, need for control, need for self-esteem, and need for self-coherence. So, as you can see in these slides that are prepared, there are people who acknowledge the existence of the need. Now, not necessarily denying that needs exist. Wakefield and Cuenca asked this question, well, okay, but can we explain motivation without talking about the needs? Can we agree with the following questions? Do we know how many basic needs are out there? And if there are, which ones are they? Which ones are basic? How do we know they're basic, right? Because if we look at the past literature, Henry Murray talked about 8 need domains with 17 sub-needs. There's Abraham Maslow's, familiar hierarchy of 5 needs. David McClelland's 3 basic motivating needs: need for power, need for achievement, need for affiliation, and the other 2, SDT and Carol Dweck's argument that we have already looked at, where they talk about either 3 basic needs or 3 basic plus 4 compound needs. So they ask further these questions. So is there a way to directly, assuming there are basic needs, is there a way to directly test these psychological needs as we do physical needs? And also, if there are basic psychological needs, are they universal across cultures? And more importantly, from my perspective, what the needs help us understand better that we wouldn't without them? And they pointed out several contemporary motivation theories, successful contemporary motivation theories that do not necessarily talk about the needs in the theorizing. So for example, the modern expectancy value theory, actually proposed by Jackie Eccles and Alan Wakefield, actually removed one of the needs, the need for achievement that was there in the Atkinson's original theory. Also, theories such as attribution theory, social cognitive theory, and achievement goal theory do not talk about the necessity of the needs compared to other theories that we have looked at. I have prepared 3 unresolved questions. The first one is actually, if you think about student motivation, students are motivated for a lot of different things, some academic and some not academic. And how do they combine different motivations when they have to act? When the situation calls for them to act, engage in studying, playing, and what makes them move in one direction versus the other? And that, I don't think we have clear answers to those questions. So if I can move over to the next slide. There. So they operate with different goals, values, self-efficacy, and interest. They also pursue social goals, not only academic goals, but social goals are very important. When we focus only on the expectancy value theory, even within the expectancy value, there are multiple task values and multiple costs. And so how are they being combined when students are about to take action? What sociocultural, contextual, interpersonal, and personal factors and processes are in operation? And how, as motivation researchers, as educational psychologists, how can we best study them? So Lisa Lindenbrink Garcia, for example, proposed that, hey, this is a complex phenomenon. So we have to move away from the traditional variable-centered approach and use more of the person-centered approach. Avi Kaplan also argues that motivation is a complex system and it's dynamic. So we have to take into account and those dynamic, nonlinear, contextualized and contextualized characteristics of motivation, which is not fully predictable. So we have to use different methods to be able to study, those characteristics. The second unresolved question, and this is what I find personally very interesting, is what predicts exceptional long-term achievement? So remember grit? 2007, Angela Duckworth published this article on grit, where grit predicted the GPA of Ivy League students, retention of freshman cadets in West Point, and rankings of the National Spelling Bee finalists above and beyond their IQs and conscientious scores. So later, we found that grit suffers from many conceptual and empirical problems, such as it does not distinguish itself from other existing constructs like self-control, regulation, effort regulation. And the two facets of grit, the long-term perseverance and passion, do not correlate with each other, so they don't merge into a single factor. And also, grit is only a weak and weaker predictor of success compared to other, again, existing constructs such as conscientiousness, self-efficacy, and effort regulation. However, I'd like us to think about why grit has received so much attention in the first place. And I think that's because the current motivation science does not offer a satisfactory answer to the question of, how can we predict, people will engage in intense and prolonged engagement until they can successfully achieve their long-term goal. So Jackie Eccles, in one of the recent ARA sessions, ask this question: does intense engagement require intense motivation? Being intensely involved means persisting in a particular set of activities that share the same skill set for a long time. So is there a secret recipe, for the just right blend of interest, self-efficacy, value, and the like to guarantee to keep people engaged for an extended period? Or are there multiple motivation profiles that are more or less effective in making people engage in certain things for a long time and invest their committed effort for a long period of time? Or will just one strong belief suffice? For example, if you have very strong attainment value for an activity, in other words, being good at that activity is so important to you, it's so deeply ingrained in your identity that you cannot move away from it. So you keep investing much effort toward the task to stay as somebody who's competent in that task for a long time. Is that what it takes to predict the long-term accomplishment of goals? So that's second unresolved question in my view. And finally, I hope I didn't miss any important constructs here. So do we need all these constructs? Do we need all these theories? Recently, there has been a call that maybe it's time that we move toward a general theory of motivation, despite the problems and challenges. And also, we might want to come up with a grand theory of motivation. Now, again, Alan Wakefield and Alison Coenga agrees that we might need to integrate some of the construct and some of the theories. However, they caution us. They argue that we have to be careful. Why? Because we don't want to sacrifice theoretical precision. So before trying to merge any of the constructs or theories, we have to ask, for example, which constructs are the primary candidates for integration? Don't tell me self-concept and self-efficacy, they're not, okay? Is there sufficient commonality across the theoretical assumptions across theories? And are there any topics that are really better addressed by one theory than the other? And who are the main beneficiaries of this type of integration? Are these researchers, practitioners, or students? Also, let's suppose we come up with a unified theory of motivation, does that do justice for all, including underrepresented groups? So that's the last unresolved question. There are a lot more unresolved questions in the literature, but I thought those were interesting. Again, this and much more questions and answers are dealt with in this upcoming volume. And if I can quickly show you the table of contents in this volume, there are a lot more controversies dealt with in section 2, other than the ones that I introduced to you. And also it deals with more fundamental questions like what is motivation, how do we motivate people, and what is the future of motivation science. And the authors have provided their perspective to all these questions. They actually take multiple questions to answer. So, and I thank the contributor because much of my talk were based on their writings. And with that, I'd like to end my talk and maybe answer some of the questions you might have. Okay, do we see differences in motivation factors for different cultures or subcultures? Oh, definitely. So this is another question that actually has been dealt with in the book. So we asked this question to the researchers, hey, do you think the motivational processes apply equally well across cultures, and subcultures, or do we have something uniquely different in each of the cultures? And there are some authors believe the processes are universal, but there are slight differences, whereas others see fundamentally different constructs and processes operating in different cultures. I think one example that I can give you is, and the construct that I personally grapple with because I'm a nation, is the concept of introjected regulation. And introjected regulation is typical, and avoidance motivation. So those two, introjected regulation and avoidance motivation, are typically considered as bad motivation, maladaptive motivation. However, in our culture, I guess in many of the, I shouldn't generalize, but in many of the Asian culture or Korean cultures that I'm familiar with, introjected regulation sometimes do not necessarily lead to maladaptive outcomes. And also avoidance motivation sometimes end up, students expressing high avoidance motivation tend to achieve better. And so I think there are clear differences across different cultures and subcultures. Now, whether the fundamental processes are common, that's up to further discussion. Okay, considering the controversies, let me move over how do teachers, okay, and admin on measuring academic motivation? That's another great question. Now, measuring academic motivation, if I can give the advice, I would definitely advise measuring several key motivation variables, and self-efficacy for sure, and also task value. We have, and not only me, but Harakevich and Holleman and Hannah Gaspard and a lot of researchers have recently conducted classroom implementations, and I have conducted several in elementary schools in Korea. And the improving young students' self-efficacy as well as their value perceptions produced tangible impact on their subsequent motivation. The impact on their achievement didn't become available right away. I think it takes a lot longer, and they need continued scaffolding so that their improved motivation results in higher achievement. But we clearly see very positive results out of the short, the 5 or 6 session intervention. So I think when you're interested in measuring academic motivation, you target several key motivation constructs such as self-efficacy, value, and interest, and all these, and and see where they stay and try to improve that aspects of your students. That'll be, I think, helpful. What is your recent research? What is my? Oh, thank you. What is my recent research interest? I'm trying to see. I've talked a lot about the normative goal and ability validation goal. So I'd like to see if they're distinguishable. Actually, the line of research coming out of my lab, the Brain and Motivation Research Institute at Korea University, have demonstrated that when students try to do better than others and to validate their ability, they suffer in terms of their self-control processes. In terms of paying attention to the right stimuli, or inhibit their prepotent responses, and they're not good at that. And also especially when they experience failure, then it's really bad. And one interesting finding is that, we would fully expect that result when students pursue ability validation goal, like it's consistent with Carol Dweck's original argument. But even if they're instructed and experimentally manipulated to pursue normative performance goal without having to, be concerned about ability validation, when they experience failure, their anxiety still shut up. So I think, again, going back to the controversy, I think there is something that we need to think about. And I think I'm going to continue on trying to distinguish the aspects of the achievement goal, especially with regard to the performance goal. For up and coming motivation researchers, what would you tell them in this status of educational motivation's infancy stage, adolescence? Well, where do we go from here? I think we're definitely not in the infancy stage. We know so much about how to improve, students' motivation. Okay, where do we go from here? I think there are different. If I can share my personal experience, I started out. I'm an education psychologist, but I started out looking at theoretical and methodological issues. Then I continue on with my research and realized, and I think, I don't know whether you noticed, but not all, but many of the controversies are the divide is between researchers from social psychology background, and not necessarily all the time, but a lot of times social psychology background versus researchers from educational psychology background. And I think as an educational psychologist, I've been doing research looking at the theoretical and methodological issues. And then as I get old, I feel my research needs to help real students in the real classrooms. And that's one of the reasons why I started, the classroom intervention implementation. So I think if you are starting education psychologists and motivation researchers, this is one question that you want to think about from the very beginning. I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but in order to be able to help students in the real classroom, you want to have strong scientific background. You don't want to give them wrong advices, like, myth, for example. And so it is a good idea to have this goal of helping real children and real people, but also you should focus on having your scientific base strong enough so that you can give them effective science-based, evidence-based advices, I think. Okay, are you looking at whether factors of motivation change with age? Am I looking at it? Yes, I have before. Factors of motivation change with age. So I have had a chance to look at the longitudinal databases several times, and I have also conducted several short-term longitudinal survey research. Now, factors of motivation change. There are a lot of different, you've seen this from Eccles and Wakefield's research, how the motivation generally declines. But when it comes to achievement goals, also, the younger students are definitely strong on mastery goals, but as they develop, the differentiated conceptions of ability, they move up to the upper grade levels in the elementary school. They tend to pursue performance goals more strongly. In terms of factors of motivation, I don't know exactly what the questions are asking for, but I'm not sure whether the factors of motivation change just because they're getting older, but I think it has a lot to do with the changes in the school system that they were subjected to. And the reason why I say that is because in one of my recent research, we asked students why they study at school in their own words. And one finding that caught our attention was in one of the schools, 75% of the students answered, told us that, wrote down they studied to demonstrate their ability. And we were shocked because in the other two schools, the percentage was significantly lower, like 30% or like that. So we wanted to see what's going on. And it is the only school out of the 3 schools that we tapped that was implementing the ability tracking in math and English. And so if that is not done right, at the school level, then students definitely go for pursuing wrong goals in my perspective. And is that because they simply get old? No, because that's because of the change in the environment. It's something going on in the school. So I think definitely there's got to be changes due to development per se, but I think a lot has to do with the changes in the learning environment. Can you speak to gender differences in competition? Is the idea girls experience more negative outcomes from competition? Hold up. Okay, so I'm not too familiar with this particular literature, but I think it is generally, my gut feeling is it's generally true because we girls tend to be more socially oriented. And so, and also, it's a known fact that competition sometimes involve aggression. When, it focuses on winning, then the boys are higher on those aspects. So I believe girls might experience more negative outcomes when they're subjected to competition. I'm not 100% sure I might answer that.
There's one more question that came through actually in the Q&A. And this was, what is the controversy that is most bugging you in your work?
You have to ask me that question. Self-concept and self-efficacy, of course. Denying the distinction between the two is denying my 25-year contribution to education psychology literature. Hey folks, look up the article. I don't know, I might have to write another one, but I do believe they are different. They're definitely different. So that's bugging me the most. Thank you for asking.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Dr. Bong, thank you so much for your presentation. I've actually just included 2 different links. One is to just the information in general about Dr. Bong's book, which I personally look very much forward to looking through. I'm sure Jason does as well. In addition to Dr. Bong, we'd like to thank our webinar committee for their help planning this webinar, and our friends in the division for ensuring that things run so smoothly as they always do. All right, thank you again. Thank you so much.